One of Chomsky's influences is the philosopher John Dewey, and he said something about how democracy begins in conversation. So I'm not going to say much more, and I'm very curious to hear what questions and comments you all have for Robert at this point. One last comment I will make, though, is last time I checked, the Noam Chomsky Facebook page had over 900,000 likes. And so it's good to see the Chomsky effect going out over social media. And also recently on Book TV, on C-SPAN, they have this weekend show where Book TV, they air videos on nonfiction books, and it covers the whole gamut. There's a lot of books being cranked out by right-wing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, and they're on Book TV like every week. But when Book TV does something leftish, they do it very well. They'll have Amy Goodman and Nader. They've had Chomsky on several times throughout the years, and just a couple of months ago, they had Chomsky speaking about his book on anarchism, and it was fascinating, and figures like Rudolf Rocker were getting a big audience. And so getting back to that initial quote from Bertrand Russell about the problems of propaganda and the harm it's causing around the world, definitely keep in mind there's this growing network of resistance to that propaganda, and more honest stories being told. And again, Bob, thank you for your contribution to that. And so
Thank you.
I'll leave it to you all.
Have you questions? I mean, I know that a lot of you are involved in Latin American work as well. I've just finished a book called A Social Injustice, which is about undocumented immigrants in this country. So I'd be most curious to know what you're working on. The conclusion to this book, this is my third book on immigration. I got the same conclusion. Open the damn borders and everything will be. So, but if there's I'd love to know what you're working on or interested in, or questions about a border of this world.
I can do that first, because I have three different questions. One is that when I was talking to you before about Chomsky, it's pretty dense for me.
Yes.
So I had to go to something a little lighter. So I've read a lot of Edward Abbey. And I've read a lot of, recently I'm reading a book about Edward Abbey by his best friend, which is really the most enlightening. So this might be really enlightening too.
I hope so.
It's more enlightening about by this Jack Locke than it was reading his books. But he was an anarchist, and in this book about his life explains his understanding of anarchism, which is what you're talking about. But he was really criticized for some of what he said about the Mexican immigrants coming over, and because and by a lot of his liberal friends, because he basically said, well, what they need is a really good meal, give them some money, and then a gun and a lot of ammunition, and they have back home to finish the revolution. Because they said, well, you're against that. No, he says, no, I'm not. They don't want to be here. They're leaving something that they don't want to leave. So why don't we help them do that instead of, all we're doing is slowing that down, Why don't we help them do what they really need to do? So I thought, I don't know what you think about that.
I think that does sound like a very good idea. The handing out guns part. We do a lot of that in this country. It seems like it seems like.
But who do we hand them out to?
People who then end up turning them back to us. Certainly, one of the ways in which we arm the population, the Mexican population, as you know, is that we incarcerate them and give them a situation in which they have no hope for the future, and in which they have been criminalized in many cases for doing our laundry and gardening for us and serving us in restaurants. And then we put them in jail for a long time, and they learn that surviving in jail sometimes requires joining gangs, and they learn that they have no chance of ever living in this country again. And then they go home, and they are armed. They're armed with anger and hatred, and they're missing their children and their family. So, I don't know, I think the system is so brutal, what we're doing to them. I think if we open up the border between Mexico and the U.S., we will have a flow of labor north and then back again, because I think a lot of them want to go home, at least sometimes during the year, visit family, maybe go back permanently, it depends. But the brutality of a system that throws people in jail and then gives them no hope of ever being able to be legitimate again is outlandish, and it defies, we maybe on the left, maybe the people here tonight can think about ways of mobilizing, and sometimes it takes adopting the tactics of the opposition. One of the things that I thought that we could use is family values by the most horrendously dangerous president of my lifetime, and say that if we really support family values, if we are Americans who support family values, which most Americans say that they are, then we ought not be throwing people in jail for long periods of time for immigration offenses. And so too with so many nonviolent crimes. Criminalizing a population is arming them with hatred, and arming them with hatred leads to the types of actions that we're trying to avoid. So I don't know. It would be better to arm them with happiness, decent jobs, and a way to go home. That would be a great thing to send them back with. That would prove the goodness of our nation instead of the fear that we're putting to people.
And fair trade.
Yeah, and fair trade.
And not supporting governments that oppress their movements, whether it's labor movements or environmental movements.
And the Monsanto that destroys the local family farm and so forth. Yes, indeed.
Here as well as there.
Both, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Here as well as there. Yeah.
You mentioned anarchism and Marxism. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the similarities and differences.
It's such a complicated and fascinating area, I think. In some ways there are some similarities, but let's focus on the differences. Marx proposed the rendering private property illegitimate and making all property public. Yeah. Having some sort of a mechanism whereby the resources of the country would be allocated across to all people in some kind of an equal fashion. He, in so doing, also suggested the idea of giving the power to, you need to empower a people within the society, and the people that he chose to empower was the proletariat, the workers, and which was a very conscientious and conscious choice of his. And he had what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the proletariat would be the favored class in society. So what each of these small parts of what Marx was describing suggest is that people are more or less all the same, that people can shed their religion and their spirituality in favor of a secular state because it's just a kind of imposed orthodoxy upon them, that people should not be attached to a sense of home, a sense of place, because that's arbitrary and bourgeois, and that there should be a kind of ruling class of proletariat who would kind of, and all of this suggests that there's a strong power up here that regulates the way things work subsequently. Now, there are some of those notions may ring positive, some of them may ring quite negative. In the hands of Lenin and Stalin, it turned into unimaginable dictatorship, as you know. And many people equate Marxism with Leninism or Marxism with Stalin, which is wrong and inappropriate. Marx also talked about the idea that all relations ultimately defer to the economic relations amongst people, and that in order to change all aspects of society, you need to change the economic relations that exist between people. That So it's like an equation. If you change economic relations, it will affect what was called the superstructure, so the culture, law, so forth and so on. In this country, there were many Marxists pre-Second World War who associated themselves with, in particular, Trotsky. Trotsky, who was against the dogma that had been imposed by Stalin and Lenin, and who believed that, in fact, this equation should be reversed, and we should focus heavily upon art as a way of changing society. So these are some of the characteristics of a Marxist vision. An anarchist vision relates back to people like Proudhon in France, Kropotkin in Russia, Bakunin in Russia, Rudolf Rocker in Germany, who argued that people should be immersed in environments that stimulate through a tremendous amount of possibilities that exist for them, and that they should exist in an environment of high levels of stimulation without arbitrary authority, so that people can learn to grow in their own way. And I use that choice of grow in their own way, a kind of garden image, purposely, because it's one of the most powerful of the anarchist images is the image of the seed in the garden. And their image was that if you take a basket of seeds, let's say of tulip seeds, or bulbs, you plant them, that the bulb is going to necessarily create a tulip. A tulip bulb will always create a tulip. It's genetically made that way. But if you put it in good soil, and if you put it in the light and you water it regularly, versus putting it in poor soil or not watering it, that same potentiality will be in some ways quashed. And that idea bears also upon society, that we are all filled with potential. We all have inner abilities that are remarkable. We all are, we use the tulip here, we're all beautiful flowers of different colors. What we need is the soil, the sunlight, and the care to grow into as great a tulip as we can grow. So it's kind of a garden image. And that is distinctly different from the Marxist vision in the sense that you have this idea that the individual has potentials within him or her that are intrinsic, inside of them, that are somehow inside of their nature. And that what we need to do as a society is not dictate the terms according to which people live, but rather find a way to celebrate the difference between people and bring out their diverse characteristics, because we don't know the answers to the tough questions, and we shouldn't impose answers upon people. And here you can start hearing, that's true, that description of Marxism sounded like a lot of imposition. It sounded like a lot of, you should do this, you cannot be anti-revolutionary, you have to give up your land, and so forth and so on. So anarchism eliminates arbitrary authority and recognizes the beauty and the power and the individuality of each person without the strictures of this is what makes a good person, this is what makes a bad person, and so forth and so on, but rather saying, let's see what happens. Let's give everybody the soil, the water, and so forth. And frankly, we're all different. Under the law, we should be considered the same, but in life, we should be considered different. And that connects very strongly to Chomsky. Chomsky, who believes that you are born with characteristics that are distinctive to you. Some of you are amazing dancers, poets, writers, thinkers, doctors. You have these native abilities. They're inside of you. And it may be the case that 3 children, even triplets, will end up manifesting 3 very, very different abilities, which means that we're only partially affected by the environment. We're also largely affected by our inner abilities with which we're born. So the question for anarchists becomes not, how can we create sameness, but rather, how can we allow difference to flourish and see what happens? So one of the reasons why it's interesting to write a biography of somebody is to see their path. So Chomsky's teacher, I'll give you a small example. Chomsky's teacher, this guy here, believed that he was going to solve the problem of linguistics once and for all. He was the Benjamin Franklin Professor of Linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania. He was writing a book called Structural Linguistics, which was going to solve the question of how language works with an ostensibly mathematical approach, an engineering approach that talked about the relationship between components. Chomsky, whose father was also a grammarian and who had published in journals similar to Zellig Harris, tried to work in that same framework to solve the problem because he was working with a linguist. But he concluded, as a relatively young man, that this system was not going to work. He finished his doctorate, which was a chapter of something that he was working on, and he got a job in a lab with Victor Ingve doing mechanical translation. And he said, this will never work. What you're doing here will never work because it's built on structuralist principles which will not work. Nonetheless, Victor Ingve hired him, and he worked on his own stuff instead. And eventually, he founded a department at MIT based on his work. The department was called Linguistics and Philosophy, but what he was doing was not recognizably linguistics, because he claimed that our abilities, our language abilities, are biological and not mechanical, and that you are born and the children are born with a faculty to and a proclivity to create language because of a pre-existing structure inside of them, that they didn't learn language the way we learn other things, because you are biologically endowed with the ability to create language. So how does this relate to anarchism? It relates in the sense that he wasn't fitting into some kind of a structure. He was himself saying something that flew completely in the face of what everybody else was saying. But he was none, and in some respects, you could claim that MIT was basically saying, you're asking interesting questions, you're coming up with some interesting answers, we don't know what the hell you're doing, really, but we will provide you with the soil and the sunlight to grow it, and let's see what comes of it. This is somewhat of a caricature, but not really. And what's unfortunate, I think, in our society is that in certain places, that type of thinking thrives. Difference, possibility, who are you, what do you know, what do you think you could do, and so forth and so on. Let's try it. Let's be brave and try it. And other parts of our society are, you're either this or you're out. If you don't go to this, then we're not going to let you in there. If you don't fill this out, then if your father's not this, your mother's not this, right? That kind of, and that to me is a big difference in the anarchistic thinking. Anarchistic thinking is a natural kind of, you got kids. You don't want them to be like you necessarily. You'd like them to be like themselves. So what do? You fill up your house with Legos and chemistry sets and art and paint brushes, and you say, okay, kid, go. And you don't say, if you don't become just like me, I'm going to punish you. Or if you're not a good whatever, then I'm going to... No, you try and create, as long as they don't hurt themselves or others, you're a family. And you try and treat them in a way that is respectful to their abilities. And when they say, but I really love to, turn pencil sharpeners into art, and you say, well, kid, I'm going to save up for pencil sharpeners, and that's cool. That's kind of awesome. And that to me is a big difference, because certainly what Marxism turned into, but even in its very core, it has a sense that it's the environment that matters, because we are products of the environment. Chomsky says we're not products of the environment, and thank goodness, because if we were, we would operate within a very narrow set of possibilities. If behaviorism was true, then you would only be as creative as your own environment is. You couldn't possibly be different from your environment. And we all know from having children that our children are very different from the environments within which they grow up. And it's very cool to have multiple children who are all really different. You say you got the same parents, you ate the same food, you grew up in the same house, and you're completely different. And I love that. We're not completely, but... And that is, I think, a very, very big difference. So to me, anarchism, in that respect, is very familiar to us. And I think as a teacher, I can say that my job is not to impose my vision upon the students. That would be silly. My job is to create an environment in which they wish to learn and wish to do things, but also wish to do things in their own way. And let's see what happens. And you know, maybe you'll end up starting a department of something we can't even imagine right now, and go for it. I couldn't be happier.
One quick comment related to that. In addition to how interesting it can be to find the precursors to some of Chomsky's political philosophy, it's always interesting finding his contemporaries and allies of his and books that he blurbs. And on the issue of parenting and education, he has an ally named Alfie Kohn, Kohn, who's written a lot of books on the problems with standardized tests. And he's also written a lot on parenting. He has a book called Unconditional Parenting, which is really interesting. And I noticed some of the right-wing radio hosts that I monitor, they do not like Alfie Kohn because he does not emphasize hyper-competitiveness either. He's more talking about cooperation among kids and how they play and how they interrelate and how they grow up. But
yeah.
One other question about what his thinking was in terms of some of the environmental issues, because I mean these are all really important issues in terms of the society. But if my own feeling is if we don't figure out the environmental ones, all these will be irrelevant. And I don't know if you've heard of David Abram, Spell of the Sensuous.
Yes, I have.
Oh, okay. And because I just think it's one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. And his parents were Jewish, and he was really into philosophy and linguistics and the whole thing. And his big concern is that we've lost our connection with nature, and as a species, almost lost our connection with nature. We may completely lose it soon.
Yeah. Well, to be perfectly honest, I was kind of hoping sometime around now to turn to you and ask you that question, because we're doing social justice, but it's going to be meaningless if every year we have less species, every year our water is more polluted, every year the sky is more polluted, every year we're destroying more forests and more crops and more trees. And so I have this horrendously sad talk that I wrote about environmentalism for your group to bring with me, because I honestly am going through a kind of crisis where I think that after so many years of being involved with social justice, I'm feeling an incompatibility between that and environmental justice. I'll give you one stark image that I have in my mind of this. I went to Rwanda. I helped, through my immigration work, a group of families to come back to come together subsequent to the genocide, to be reunited as families in Canada. And as a consequence, I became very, very friendly with a large number of Rwandan and Burundian people. And they invited me to Rwanda I didn't realize it, but they were going to offer me a job at Université de Butare it was a conflict resolution center. And while I was there, I was with this a very, very dear friend, and he wanted to help me find whatever I was looking for in the country. So I asked him to take me to prisons, which were at that time holding 300,000 people in conditions that were so unimaginably atrocious. I can't begin to describe it, but one of the ways I can say it is that there was no room for anybody to lie down. So they were packed together in holding areas, and they would sleep standing up, sort of just leaning on each other. They spent their entire day standing up. There was literally no place to sit down, and this was years after the genocide. So that was one place that I went. I also went to commemoration sites, where one of the commemoration sites right near Butare is famously held 35,000 bones that you could see, 35,000 bodies, which you could see because they were in kind of open graves. So, but I also went to refugee camps. And one of the camps I went to was on a mountain. And the UN had built a camp, and there was probably 20 or 25,000 people in it. And if you looked at, Rwanda, if you've not been there, is incredibly lush. It's an incredibly beautiful country. It's astonishing. And all the mountains are very lush. It's kind of jungle. And you come to this refugee camp, and everywhere where the camp was, and then another 4 or 5 miles around it, it was a wasteland. It looked like a desert because they were cutting down the trees and picking the plants in order to survive. And you realize there's an incompatibility between the surviving as it's done in this fashion and the surviving done in nature, and that ultimately they're killing the nature around them, and in so doing eventually killing themselves. And that to me is an image of what we're doing in this planet. So, and in this talk that I had written, every story, and here's my proposal, because I brought work with me. Here's my proposal. We rewrite the New York Times every day, but with the impact of every story on the environment. So we're like, oh, good, we found an oil slick. Maybe that's the downed jetliner. No, there's an oil slick. This is what it is. This is how many fish it's killed. And by the way, there's an airplane under it. Or there's an area. We all remember these stories about these pirates off the coast of Somalia. Well, what were the pirates doing there, and why were they there? Well, here's the real story. The real story is the Europeans were giving their crap, their garbage, to the mafia to dispose of. And as you know, the mafia buries trash under the ground, which pollutes the soil and so forth and so on. But they were also dumping it in, they were filling up boats with it and shipping it to Somalia and dumping it in the water. So they were destroying the local the natural infrastructure around Somalia. And the Somalis, who could no longer make a living, started partly as a revolutionary movement to start attacking ships. And in so doing, also destroyed and are destroying the coral around Somalia. So here's the New York Times story. Coral around Somalia being destroyed, water being polluted by the Europeans, and oh, by the way, some ships are also going. Because in social justice, you also have this, yay, we saved that wealthy family who happened to be yachting near Somalia. Oh, yeah, we killed 600,000 fish, and we polluted all that water, but oh, good, that happy couple who was trying to just have a nice vacation in Somalia, we saved them, and by the way, we also sent an ocean liner over there to save them, and it polluted. So take every news story and begin with the environmental impact and then talk about what happened to the people. And make it our measure of social justice to say, how did the environment fare in this one? And if it fared badly, then we didn't do a good job. That's my proposal. That's what I'd like to do next. That's going to be a little bit of work. But, I mean, to a group like this, with people like yourselves, yes?
You started, or you mentioned a few minutes ago, the dichotomy between environmental justice and social justice. And you used as an example the devastation around the refugee
yes.
camp. I'm confused. We've created a tremendous social injustice by depriving people of their connection to the land.
Totally.
And then when that results in an environmental injustice, the destruction of the place that we plant them,
right,
that would seem not to be a dichotomy. That seems like a logical consequence.
No.
And those two forms of justice are totally related.
But let's say you say we have a flow of 30,000 people coming from Rwanda into Burundi. Our method now is to create a secure zone watched over by les casques bleus to protect these, and we build an artificial city in nature. Might there be another way to create a refugee camp that would be a sustainable refugee camp in which you didn't destroy the earth?
If we could eliminate the concept of refugees,
yes,
Then
Totally.
we have no refugee camps.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. But let's begin with, first of all, the short term, but also, you know, a refugee is also somebody, there's a lot of different forms of refugees. A tsunami creates, the refugee may be the wrong, it's a legal term, so let's use a more appropriate legal term. Let's say displaced people. A tsunami creates a tremendous number of displaced people. And we have to, I think, pay attention to not only saving those people who are displaced by a terrible natural disaster, but also to providing for their basic needs and wants without creating more devastation. That's, I think, what I'm saying. So does that seem fair? And that's where it, and again, I only use it as a symbol because we have, you know, you also, people die in a submarine, let's say, and we have to go and get their bodies. So we bring a battleship. We spend 4 weeks. I think this is what, the Norwegians or something a couple of years ago, trying to recover some bodies. And you know, you pour hundreds of thousands of polluted whatever into the water to go and get these 8 bodies. Each one of these acts that we commit as humans has such a terrible impact. And I if only to play it up. Like, I don't know for you, if this pirate story was new to you. It was new to me when I looked it up. I did not know that. And I think that having a newspaper that would do the news stories that we need to have every day, but always mentioning the environment and maybe mentioning it first, it might bring to consciousness a little bit, and it might prevent us from having, you know, sugar packets made that we then throw away rather than a thing full of sugar. It might prevent us from devastating in the name of saving, and that's why I come to you heart in hand to a social justice center and say, I feel like you feel, honestly. I feel like we need to deal with this. We need to rethink this. This is not sustainable, and I don't want to be sitting here talking about social justice with the knowledge that in 100 years we have no chance of still being around. Not to mention, I don't know how many tens of thousands of species and mammals and flowers and everything else destroyed along the way. It's horrendous.
On the issue of environmental justice, and since we're talking about brilliant minds and activists, I want to mention Robert's story of the deforestation going on in Rwanda. Who came to mind for me was Wangari Maathai of Kenya, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. And her project and her legacy is this movement called the Green Belt Movement. And she saw the same deforestation in her country of Kenya. And you know, the creeks dried up and the trees were gone and the critters were gone. And she started replanting parts of Kenya, and other people joined her. And she got a lot of resistance at first. The military was coming down on them and the news media, but she kept at it and other people joined her. And 40 million trees later, some of those streams are running again and some of the animals are back. She passed, sadly, about 3 years ago, but there's a lot of good books about her, like 3 wonderful children's books and a great documentary called Taking Root. So, Martin, please.
I just wanted to throw out a few things I like about Chomsky that impressed me. One was when he said, if we really had functioning political science departments, then why is it that the Pentagon papers are almost never checked out or discussed in class?
Absolutely.
And I found this fascinating because what I got from Chomsky is that you don't need to be political scientists. You need to read, you need to connect.
Yeah.
And also that you can trust the Financial Times of London or The Economist, where they don't talk about domestic stuff, but where they talk about things that the business community needs to know.
Right. Yeah.
It has to be right, or else things fall apart.
Right.
And what really impressed me, the first book I read by Chomsky was Necessary Illusions. And at the time, I still had patience, and I read all the footnotes, and I even went to seek out those that were accessible. I was impressed. Most of it was public knowledge.
Yes.
I could go to the microfiche at the time.
Yes.
And look it up. And there was, and in that brilliant mind, it all fit together like a puzzle.
It's so true.
I had the opportunity to interview Chomsky once after the first Iraq war, and the second part of the interview that wasn't published, I asked him how he does it, and I learned that basically he has a huge network of friends.
Exactly.
Not just in Israel, but
Yeah, all around the world.
and they know what he's interested in.
Yeah.
And they will supply him with nuggets
Yeah.
that substantiate
Yep.
what he's thinking about.
Well, I've for 25 years I've been doing that, sending him stuff that I'm working on, including, refugee testimonies and so forth, both for his input, but also so that he knows.
This is something that not enough people do.
Yeah.
We always assume that experts, be they professors or legislators or people in city government, know stuff.
Yeah.
They don't know shit. I mean, they only know what comes across.
Yeah.
And if you are somebody who knows something that explains circumstances or shows solutions, tell these people.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised how often somebody who is a VIP and you think he reads all the time, or she has no clue
Right.
about an author who went into depths
Yeah.
on a certain subject.
Absolutely. And, so many of the things that you said resonate strongly, not only, political science departments are, the stuff that's taught it really is remarkable. One of the people who's not taught in any political science department I've ever seen is Chomsky. He's also not taught in Latin American studies. In any department I've ever seen, I don't see his work. Somebody who's done this much work in Latin American studies, even in courses on Vietnam, you don't see his stuff. There's such a narrow band of stuff that's taught. It's frightening and horrendous. The other department that he talks a lot about is economics, and that's there is this my favorite anecdote. Well, I have a couple. One of them was that I knew very well the chairman of the board of the largest company in Canada. He said that he knew everything about the company. He was the chairman of the board, but he could not, in either the short term or the long term, predict the movement of the stock, even though he was calling the shots, whatever. That was useful to know in terms of insider knowledge. And the other one is that the story I'm sure you've all heard, where they've trained a monkey to throw darts, and every day he throws a dart at a stock, and there's somebody who buys it, and that monkey has consistently outperformed Wall Street. It says a lot. But it also says a lot, and this is where Chomsky's both funny and provocative, when he says that if we wanted to put people in jail for crimes against humanity, we ought to go to economics departments, where they have come up with proposals, through the IMF or the World Bank, that impoverish people, having them pay back debts for which they're not responsible, that should never have been incurred in the first place. The real horrors of our society are imposed by these so-called experts who are creating poverty and creating, not to mention, the so-called experts who are creating the climate disasters and so forth. So you hear that, and we're so used to saying, "Oh, yes, sir, Mr. Professor, oh, Dr. Professor." It's nonsense, these nonsensical ways in which people interrelate in places like universities. And the kowtowing that goes on to power is just disgusting and despicable and wrong. But it gets perpetuated. But to hear somebody like him say it, and then to measure your own experience and say, actually, yeah, it's true. I have lots of political science students who know absolutely nothing about local politics, or I actually can't figure out what they do know about politically. Yeah, that's a real eye-opener right there. I teach literature. And and there's a chapter in here about literature, because I think that if there's a place of inspiration, or whatever you want to call it, redemption, hope, and here's a fun book to write. Since we already got one project, here's another fun one. I think you could do something about America as represented by the Beat generation and by Noam Chomsky. Because the Beats were real Americans. They were real Americans. They were, they were so free in their behaviors, and they were so generous. We all keep journals when we're traveling, and we write poetry in them because it's as though we were given the right to say, you know what, your poetry is good and it's really cool, and maybe you wrote it when you were high, and maybe you wrote it when you were high and driving your car, whatever the hell you were doing, but it's awesome shit, and write it, because that's really good and it's really cool, and you should be free, and you should be set free from the shackles of the kind of canonical literature that we're all bowing to. And there's something really beautiful about that. And I think there's something really nostalgic in somebody like Allen Ginsberg for an America in which my millions of sperm and my 25 cents and my 2.5 joints in my pocket, I am America. Like, that's an awesome line. That's an awesome line. I am America. Not, I am, wealthy, and I got an American Express card and an Apple iPhone and a big home, and I am American. That's bullshit. And I think to think about them as pushing the level, the buttons of freedom, and not just saying that they're free, but actually being free, and creating that in their art would be a beautiful study that I think would be both fun to read and very eye-opening. It's a real group of great Americans, I think. I say that as a Canadian who really loves it all.
We have to end this because it seems against the whole philosophy of what we're saying.
We'll just carry on forever.
We do. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much
Robert,
for having me.
and
Thank you.
Preston.